the shepherd king, and it comes because we're in this season of graduation, so I'm going to kind of play on that. And the verse that was read this morning from 2 Samuel chapter 7 is just kind of the precursor to what we have on the board in the other room, the seed line, what we call the seed line promise is part of that. This is leading up to that. But I'm going to reread that passage because the ESV has a different, the word is leader, and I like when Bradley read this, but ESV translates it as prince, so there's all these different names. The title of the lesson today is the shepherd king, but really it's an example of God showing us leadership in a godly way versus worldly leadership. So let's look at it again. It's in 2 Samuel chapter 7, verses 8 through 11 is where we're going to get our lesson points today. And it says, "Now therefore, thus you shall say to my servant David, thus says the Lord of hosts, I took you from the pasture, from following the sheep, that you should be prince over my people Israel. And I have been with you whenever you went out and have cut off all your enemies from before you. And I will make for you a great name, like the name of the great ones of earth. And I will appoint a place for my people Israel, and I will plant them so that they may dwell in their own place and be disturbed no more. And violent men shall afflict them no more as formerly, from the time that I appointed judges over my people Israel. And I will give you rest from all your enemies. Moreover, the Lord declares to you that the Lord will make you a house." So that's our text. And I wanted to continue. We've been making this contrast because we're looking at the kings. And so we had this contrast of Saul, that the people kind of, they would have chosen Saul. He was what we say head and shoulders above the rest, just physically in stature. He's just taller than everybody. But there is this contrast. God chooses David and says he's a man after my own heart, and he's this shepherd boy, and he's the youngest of Jesse's boys, and they were all these other boys that Samuel thought were better choices. And God even revealed to Samuel, he says, look, I have my reasons for why I want to pick David. But I want to contrast this, like I said, in the season of graduation. There are two notable degrees that we receive. And it was a joy. You know, we had our graduation yesterday, and we had our graduate, Philip, down there go across the stage, and it was just great to see. Great ceremony, if you get a chance to watch it if you haven't seen it. But they're honored with this degree. They put the time in, and so we get a degree, and we call that an academic degree, where we're recognized for the time that we put in our studies. And the degree acknowledges that we've met the standard of the study. So there are exams and things like, but we haven't really been tested, right, in the world with it. We just are being acknowledged that we've met the standard and we've covered the material. But there's another degree that the world recognizes, and it's called an honorary degree. And that honorary degree is bestowed on people who, after they've accomplished great things and they want to, maybe dedicate a wing to a school or something to, and they will bestow on them an honorary degree because they're recognizing the work that they've already done. And rather than, in my experience growing up, we would put it this way. There are those who, study from the academy, and then there are those who study from the world of hard knocks. And either way, you're in a classroom, and you've got to grow up and mature. And either way, you're going to be recognized or honored based on how well you perform. But that's the contrast between David and Saul. So if you will permit me, we would say that Saul was given this, he was recognized, kind of came up through the ranks. But David is kind of given this honorary degree. because nobody would have picked David. And so if we go back where we left off, remember I said we had this contrast between David and Saul, but Saul had, his champion was Abner, and David's champion was Joab. And remember where we left off, remember David and Joab get into the camp of Saul. Saul brings out 3,000 men now to pursue David. After how many times we're going to see is David anointed king, but Saul doesn't accept it, and he goes out, and every time he says, no, I won't do that again, and now he brings out more men. But David and Joab go into the camp, and Joab wants to spear Saul and put an end to this. And David says, no, you can't kill the Lord's anointed. But they took his spear and his water. And then when they got to the other side, remember, David calls him out and basically calls out Abner. He says, man up, Abner. You're supposed to protect the king, and you didn't do a job. Your life is forfeit. But there's that contrast. And then once again, Saul says, well, I'll never do that again. But if you now come into 2 Samuel, back in where we are, we're in chapter 7, but if you go back to chapter 2, and we'll pick up this story. In chapter 1 of 2 Samuel, we see Saul's death is announced to David. And David's told of Saul and Jonathan died on the battlefield. And David laments over Saul and Jonathan. And then, once again, in chapter 2 of 2 Samuel, verse 4, all the men of Judah came out, and there they anointed David king over the house of Judah. So once again, David's publicly now, again, anointed king. But notice, he's anointed king over Judah. What happens is Abner, Saul's champion, he's not giving up. And what he does is he takes Saul, another one of Saul's son, I'm probably not going to say the name right, but Ishbosheth, and Abner makes him king over Israel. And so this, again, the conflict continues. And it's basically this conflict of Abner and Joab. And they keep battling back and forth. But as time goes on, David keeps increasing. And after this great battle of Gibeon, we see that Abner is greatly reduced. A lot of men fall, but only 19 of David's men under Joab. And so eventually you get to chapter 3, and this contest has been going on between Joab and Abner. And Abner decides to join forces with David finally. And here's what sets it off. Abner, I don't know how I can say this delicately, but Abner takes one of Saul's concubines. But Ishbosheth, did I say that right? One of Saul's concubines. Ishbosheth is Saul's son, and he calls Abner out on it. And Abner's like, he's at his limit. And if you follow the narrative, Abner's out fighting the battle. Basically, we would say in our time, it's probably not a good summation, but Abner set up Ishbosheth as kind of like the figurehead. But Abner's the one, he's the one that made Ishbosheth king, and he's the one fighting the battles, and he's not doing well. And he recognizes David. And now Ishbosheth is going to call him out on this, and so Abner kind of responds to that. And this is what he says in chapter 3, starting in verse 9. God, do so to Abner and more also, if I do not accomplish for David what the Lord has sworn to him. So almost, we would say it's like, how dare you, to Ishbosheth, call me out on this matter. And he says, now, verse 10, this is 2 Samuel chapter 3, verse 10, to transfer the kingdom from the house of Saul and set up the throne of David over Israel and over Judah from Dan to Beersheba. And Ishbosheth, he couldn't answer Abner because he was in fear of him, right? And so that's kind of leading up to this next event. So in verse 21 of chapter 3, Abner said to David, I will arise and go and will gather all Israel to my lord the king, that they may make a covenant with you, and that you may reign over all that your heart desires. So David sent Abner away in peace. So basically, Abner comes in, makes a covenant now with David. These guys were enemies, right? But David, you see, remember, David is kind of like we were reading this morning in our lesson, where Joseph was set up in the land, and they're acknowledging these events are happening because God wants them to happen this way, not because of things that I did. And David, remember, Abigail kind of restrained him, where last we were talking about that, because David was going to take salvation right in his own hand, and Abigail says, I don't think you should do that. And he honors her for that. But anyway, David and Abner make a covenant. But as Abner's leaving, Joab's returning, and Joab takes it upon himself to go and strike down Abner. This is the problem with our human way of leadership, right? And why conflicts linger on so long, because of these bad feelings. Joab, you could sympathize with him, like you said this morning. If we were making a movie out of this, we kind of sympathize with some of these characters, what Joab has been through. You say, well, look at me. Easily, David could have that attitude, like Saul took that attitude, right? Look at how great I am. I beat back the enemies. Surely I deserve glory and honor because of that. But David is not pleased with this at all. He just made a covenant with them. David ends up mourning Abner's loss. And what this does, these events, just like we were saying this morning with Joseph and his interaction with his brothers, what's happening now is the people are seeing David's reactions, all of Israel, and they're saying, he's doing the right thing, and he's honoring Abner. And so, not only that, but then after this event happens, Ishbosheth, his two captains that were part of his campaigning, they come back and murder him in his sleep, basically, while he's in bed. And they think they're honoring David by dispensing. Do they not know David by this point? And so they come to kind of say, look what we've done. And David's not pleased with them either. And, they kind of sealed their fate. But in chapter 5 of 2 Samuel, once again, David is anointed king. And like I say, you look at this, how it seems like, I don't know why I pick on Claudia for this, but, the school of hard knocks, right? It seems like when you're trying to accomplish great things, there's so many setbacks, and every time you think, this time I'm over the hump, right? Something happens. They used to say in our training, right, in leadership training, you get blindsided all the time. Everything's going along fine, and then I never saw that coming. But like we mentioned this morning in class, what is our default attitude? Do we acknowledge God in any of this? Because sometimes we want to blame God. We want to call on God when we need him. But then we quickly forget when times are going good, and then we want to blame God when something bad happens to us. But do we acknowledge that God is working something out? And as I said, we can't see this. We cannot see this at the time. But if we're patient and we continue to work as to the Lord, he will bring joy. He will bring joy in our life again. It will happen, although our circumstances can't allow us to see this. So in chapter 5, 1 through 5, all the tribes of Israel came to David at Hebron and said, "Behold, we are your bone and flesh. In times past, when Saul was king over us, it was you who led out and brought in Israel. And the Lord said to you, you shall be shepherd of my people Israel, and you shall be prince over Israel." Again, that's the ESV rendering. It could be leader, king, whatever those words are. So all the elders, verse 3, of Israel came to the king at Hebron, and King David made a covenant with them at Hebron before the Lord, and they anointed David king over Israel. So here's what happened, verse 4. David was 30 years old when he began to reign, and he reigned 40 years. At Hebron, he reigned over Judah 7 years and 6 months, and at Jerusalem, he reigned over all of Israel and Judah 33 years. So there's kind of the summation. So here, finally, we have God's purpose in setting up David over this united kingdom. And so that, if you drop down, I forgot to mention this, when they killed, back in chapter 4, when they killed Ishbosheth, it was brought up, and you wonder, why did they bring this up in the text? I'm going to mess this name. Mephibosheth. I'm not going to say that again. This is one of I think this is Jonathan's son. And at the time when Ishbosheth, when they came in, they had to flee, and it said that they fell, the one caring for Mephibosheth fell, and he became lame. And you wonder, why is that in there? Well, if you drop down to 5:8, David now is going up to Jerusalem, and it's occupied by the Jebusites, and they have to go in there and get the Jebusites out. And what they did was they mocked David and his army, and they said, nobody can penetrate this. In fact, to show you how confident we are, we're going to have blind and lame people guarding, as our watchmen. And so that leads David to say, verse 8, David said on that day, whoever would strike the Jebusites, let him get up the water shaft and attack the lame and the blind who are hated by David's soul. Therefore it is said, the blind and the lame shall not come into the house. I say that because this is a really hard translation. I don't know how it reads in the way your translation, but it's a saying. What it is David wasn't saying he hates blind and lame people. It was, and I don't know how to translate this and honor the text and at the same time, but it was because they put the blind and the lame as to mock David. And because, why do we know this? Because David takes Mephibosheth into his house. So anyway, I just wanted, if you're reading the narrative, that's kind of a bizarre footnote. But verse 10, 2 Samuel 5, verse 10, and David became greater and greater, and the Lord, the God of hosts, was with him. And Hiram, king of Tyre, sent messengers to David, and cedar trees also, carpenters and masons, who built David a house. That's what leads up to this reading that we have in 2 Samuel 7. And verse 5:12 says, and David knew that the Lord had established him king over Israel, and that he had exalted his kingdom for the sake of his people Israel. But the idea now is David builds this great house for himself. And what this does is it precipitates, and I'm not going to get into the story that Alan it just sticks in my mind, that David calls for the ark to be brought in, and you know the story of Uzzah and the ark, and he strikes them down. But when they finally bring the ark in, David's dancing in front of the ark as they bring it into Jerusalem. Of Micah, who David got back. This was Saul's daughter. It was David's wife, and he finally got her back. And then she mocks him. she's not pleased at all. She kind of like, you're dancing like a fool. You look like a fool. And David kind of rebukes her, and she never has children. It's pretty bizarre story, but I'm not going to do a good a job as Alan did on that. But it leads us up to 2 Samuel 7, where David's desire is, look at all that God has done for me. I mean, David went through what he had to go through. You talk about the school of hard knocks. But here he is now. He could have never imagined that he would be in this position now with this great house, with this united kingdom. Look at the greatness. And so his desire now is to build God a house. And so we know the story, but he goes to the prophet and he says, yeah, that's a good idea. And then God speaks to the prophet, and that's where we get in 2 Samuel chapter 7. He says, you go back and tell David, no, David, you're not the one that's going to build me a house. And basically says it's your son that's going to build a house. But here's the text. Again, it starts in verse 7, 8. So he comes back and he tells David, listen, you tell David, verse 8, the Lord of hosts, I took you from the pastures and from following sheep that you should be prince over all my people Israel. Number one is God gives us a title, which is important. He calls David. Remember, it was God that called David from pasturing the flocks. And Dave says, I'm going to give you this title. But secondly, he says in verse 9, and I have been with you wherever you went, and have cut off all your enemies from before you, and I will make for you a great name, like the name of the great ones of the earth. So the second thing that God does is he makes a name for him. Well, why is that important? Well, the name is important. A title's one thing, but then he says, your name. Who doesn't know David? In fact, they got a series. I haven't seen it yet, right? But the House of David, I mean, it's just well known. But then he says in verse 10, I will appoint a place for my people Israel, and I will plant them so that they may dwell in their own place and be disturbed no more. And violent men shall afflict them no more as formerly from the time that I appointed judges over my people Israel. What God does here is he gives them a heritage. So he gives them a title, starts with a title. He says, this is who you are. Just like Israel. Israel doesn't exist until God makes the name Israel. But then he says, then I'm going to make your name great. So that it goes from title to name. But he says, then I'm going to give you a heritage. There are many people throughout history. We watch nations rise and fall. But do we remember him? No, if we didn't have the History Channel telling us or dig it up to me. But God's people have a heritage that's everlasting. It's from everlasting, it's to everlasting. So it's a heritage, and it's sure, as God's promises are sure. And finally, the end of verse 11, he says, moreover, the Lord declares to you that the Lord will make you a house. And that's our dwelling. And many references to that. Let me give you just a few verses now to go along with this. So we have a title, a name, a heritage, and a dwelling. In Psalm 78, verses 69 through 72, Psalm 78, he built his sanctuary like the high heavens, like the earth, which he has founded forever. He chose David as servant and took him from the sheepfolds. From following the nursing ewes, he brought him to shepherd Jacob, his people. Israel is his inheritance. With upright heart, he shepherded them and guided them with a skillful hand. God doesn't just call us, but he expects us to grow up in him. In John 10:14, here's that great, John chapter 10 is the great lesson on Jesus, the Good Shepherd. And in there, in verses 14 through 17 of John chapter 10, I am the good shepherd. What I want us to see here is this leadership, this shepherd leader or shepherd king is not like the world with a title where the leader says, and I love listening to Q. I mean, he doesn't know that we listen to him, but we really do. He's a trainer, but and I love being around the body because he's a leader who does, and he's recognized, and he's busy because of it, because he's asked to communicate that leadership style to others. But there are leaders that lead. That's what shepherds do. Shepherds don't say, hey, flock, the pasture's over there, go get it. No, they have to lead them, and take them there. Jesus, remember, in John 14, he says, I am the way, the truth, and the life. He says, follow me. He doesn't say, go that way. We have a great shepherd. But in John 10:14, he says, I am the good shepherd. I know my own, and my own know me. Just as the Father knows me, and I know the Father, I lay down my life for the sheep. And I have other sheep that are not of this fold. I must bring them also, and they will listen to my voice. So there will be one flock, one shepherd. For this reason the Father loves me, because I laid down my life, that I may take it up again. It was the charge that is given in Luke 2:52. Remember, we remarked on this because Samuel was the same way. He grew up in favor with God and men, and that's what it says about Jesus. Luke 2:52. And Jesus increased in wisdom and in stature and in favor with God and man. We have God's word that we're expected to grow up by. The Proverbs about this wisdom, Proverbs 3:3-4. Let not steadfast love and faithfulness forsake you. Bind them around your neck. Write them on the tablet of your heart, so you will find favor and good success in the sight of God and of man. It's like we weren't just said, weren't just told, go get him. He gave us the bread of life that we may eat and grow up by it and grow. Paul's charge to Timothy in 1 Timothy 4:11 and 12, he says, I want you to aspire to live quietly and to mind your own affairs and to work with your hands as we instructed you, so that you may walk properly before outsiders and be dependent on no one. And and at the time, that was a difficult task. We've been talking about in our Bible lessons, the first century world, the awfulness of the environment that they were living in. So it was important. But in John 13, you have this scene. It's where Jesus puts on the towel. It's what we call the Last Supper, and Jesus is going to gird himself and wash his disciples' feet. And in John 13:13-17, he says, you call me teacher and Lord, and you are right, for so I am. If then I, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you also ought to wash one another's feet, for I have given you an example, that you should do just as I have done to you. Truly, truly, I say to you, a servant is not greater than his master, nor a messenger greater than the one who sent him. If you know these things, blessed are you if you do them. In John 1, back in the beginning, here's this final charge to us in the season of graduation. John began his gospel in John chapter 1, verses 12-13. But to all who did receive him, who believed in his name, he gave the right to become children of God, who were born not of blood, nor of the will of the flesh, nor of the will of man, but of God. What we have is the greatest honor bestowed on us, to be called the children of God. It is an awesome responsibility to understand that as we grow up and we learn from his word and we feed on it and we start to grasp the gravity of that, we're to follow the Master as fishers of men and shepherds of souls is the greatest task that the world has. That's our charge today.